The bell in the village tower had not yet finished its third toll when Marianne Ashworth smelled the smoke. She was carrying 2 pails of water up from the well, her arms aching, her skirts damp at the hem from the morning's spill, when the wind shifted and brought with it that acrid, choking sweetness that meant more than a hearth fire gone wrong. She stopped in the lane, set the pails down without thinking, and looked toward the tree line where the old Latham stable stood at the edge of the common pasture, half a mile from the nearest cottage. A column of black smoke was already rising above the elms, thick and furious, twisting upward like something alive. Nobody else had noticed yet. The farmers were out in the far fields. The children were at their lessons in the chapel schoolroom. Old Mrs. Pruitt was hanging linens behind her cottage and humming to herself. Oblivious, for one suspended moment, Marianne stood utterly alone with the knowledge of the fire. And in that moment, something in her simply decided, without ceremony or hesitation, that she would run toward it. She did not call for help first. She would think of that later, and wonder if she ought to have. But in the instant itself there was no time for wondering, only the sight of flame licking along the old dry timbers of a structure that had stood, forgotten and half collapsed already, for longer than she had been alive. And stables, even ruined ones, sometimes held more than hay. She ran. Her boots struck the packed earth of the lane, then the softer give of the pasture grass, her breath tearing at her chest before she had gone even 100 yards. The smoke thickened as she approached, stinging her eyes, and beneath the roar of the flame she heard something that made her blood turn cold and her legs move faster than she had known they could. A low groan, human, unmistakable, coming from somewhere within that collapsing structure. She did not stop to consider what manner of man might be found in a derelict stable at the far edge of the parish, why he might be there, or what peril she invited by going in after him. She thought only that a voice had cried out, and that no one else was near enough to hear it, but her. The doorway nearest her was half consumed already, the old wood curling black and orange, but a section of the eastern wall had buckled outward, leaving a gap choked with smoke but passable if she stooped low and moved quickly. She pulled the edge of her apron up over her nose and mouth, said a swift and wordless prayer, and went in. The heat inside struck her like a physical blow. Sparks rained from the collapsing rafters above, and the air was a solid, burning thing that seared her throat with every breath. She dropped low, beneath the worst of the smoke, and crawled forward across a floor, littered with fallen beams and old brittle straw that caught and smouldered wherever the sparks touched down. She found him near the far wall, half buried beneath a fallen roof timber, his coat scorched black along one shoulder, his face streaked with soot and blood from a gash above his brow. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, and even unconscious there was something in the set of his jaw, something in the stillness of him even in pain, that struck her as strange for a man she took to be some vagrant traveller or drover, caught sheltering from the previous night's rain. There was no time to wonder at that either. She braced her shoulder beneath the timber and pushed with everything her slight frame possessed, crying out with the effort, feeling splinters bite into her palms. It would not move. Above her, the remaining roof groaned, a sound like the earth itself complaining, and she understood with a clarity that frightened her more than the fire itself that she had perhaps 30 seconds, no more, before what remained of that structure came down entirely. She looked for another way. A shorter beam, fallen at an angle, gave her the purchase she needed. She wedged it beneath the larger timber and threw her whole weight against it, and this time, with a groan of tortured wood, the beam shifted just enough. She seized the stranger beneath his arms and pulled. He was heavier than any burden she had ever carried, and for one terrible moment she thought her strength would fail entirely, that she would simply crumple beside him in the smoke, and both of them would be found, if they were found at all, side by side in the ash. But something in her, some stubborn, unyielding thread that had carried her through harder winters than most, refused that ending. She dug her heels into the smouldering straw and pulled again and again, dragging him inch by inch toward the gap in the wall. Her lungs screaming, her vision swimming with smoke and effort. They broke through into daylight together, she falling backward with him half atop her, both of them gasping air that tasted, after the stable's furnace heat, impossibly sweet. Behind them, with a sound like the sky itself splitting, the remaining roof gave way entirely, timbers and burning thatch collapsing inward in a great gout of sparks and smoke that rolled out across the pasture like a wave. She had gotten him out with perhaps 10 seconds to spare. For a long moment Marianne simply lay in the trampled grass, coughing, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of exertion and fear, staring up at a sky gone strange and orange through the drifting smoke. Then the stranger beside her stirred, and she turned to him and pushed herself up on one arm to look at his face properly for the first time. He was not old, perhaps 35, though the soot and the blood made it hard to judge. And even wounded and senseless, there was a certain quality to his features, a strength of bone, an unconscious dignity in the line of his mouth, that seemed at odds with the plainness of his travelling clothes, torn now and blackened by fire. His hands, she noticed without quite meaning to, were not the hands of a labourer. There was something in that observation that troubled her faintly, like a stone in a shoe, but she had no leisure to examine it. He was breathing, but poorly, and the gash above his brow was bleeding freely, and there was a redness along his forearm that she recognized with a physician's daughter's eye as the mark of a serious burn. "Sir," she said, shaking him gently by the shoulder that was not injured. "Sir, can you hear me?" He did not wake, but he breathed, steady if shallow, and his pulse beneath her fingers at his throat was strong. That, at least, was something. She looked back toward the village, toward the smoke now surely visible to anyone with eyes, and knew that help would come, but not quickly enough, perhaps, for a man bleeding and burned in a field a half-mile from the nearest door. She could not carry him alone. She would have to bring aid to him. But she would not leave him unwatched, not with the fire still roaring behind them, and sparks still drifting on the wind toward the dry grass of the pasture. She tore a strip from her own petticoat, pressed it hard against the wound at his brow, and held it there with one hand while with the other she waved, and called toward the lane, her voice raw from smoke, until at last she saw figures emerging from the village. Tom Wicket from the smithy running full out, and behind him old Dr. Aldous with his bag already in hand, for the smoke had been seen from the church tower, and word had travelled fast. It was only later, much later, after the stranger had been carried on a hurdle to the Wicket cottage, after his wounds had been dressed and his burns salved, and his breathing pronounced steady, if not yet safe. It was only then, sitting outside in the cool evening air with her hands still black with soot and trembling faintly from the day's terror, that Marianne allowed herself to wonder who, precisely, she had pulled from the flames. He carried no papers. His coat, though torn and burned, was of a finer cloth than she had first taken it for in the chaos of the moment, a fine dark wool, well cut, the kind a prosperous merchant might wear, though something in its severity suggested a man of even higher standing travelling deliberately plain. There was a ring on his smallest finger, a heavy band of gold unadorned, that he had not removed even for travel. And there was, Dr. Aldous observed quietly as he worked, an old scar along the man's ribs that spoke of a duel, or a soldier's wound. Not the ordinary hazards of a workingman's life. "He'll live, I think, if the fever doesn't take him," the doctor said, wiping his hands. "But I confess I don't know what to make of him. No one in the parish knows his face. No cart or horse was found near the stable. He must have come afoot, or been set down and left. A strange business. He was in the stable when I found him," Marianne said, "sheltering perhaps from last night's storm. Perhaps the doctor did not sound entirely convinced, but he did not press further, and Marianne, exhausted past the point of curiosity, did not either. She sat with the stranger a while longer, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest by candlelight, before Mrs. Wicket gently insisted she go home and rest. That there was nothing more to be done that night that could not wait for morning. She went home. But she did not sleep easily, and when she did, she dreamed of flame and of a stranger's face, and woke before dawn with the strange, persistent sense that something in her life had shifted, quietly and irrevocably, in the space of one afternoon. He did not wake for 2 days. Marianne came each morning to the Wicket cottage, ostensibly to help with the dressing of his wounds, for Dr. Aldous had remarked that her steady hands and calm manner were more use to him than half the grown men in the village, who grew faint at the sight of burned flesh. In truth, she came because she could not entirely stay away, because some part of her needed to see, with her own eyes, that the man she had pulled from the fire was still breathing, still fighting his way back from whatever dark country the fever had dragged him into. On the second evening, as she sat by the low bed changing the dressing on his arm, his eyes opened. They were a clear, startling grey, and for a moment they simply fixed on her face with the confused, unguarded intensity of a man not yet certain whether he dreamed or woke. Then his lips moved, cracked and dry, and he managed, in a voice like gravel dragged over stone, a single word. "Fire, it's out," she said gently, setting down the cloth and reaching for the cup of water Mrs. Wicket kept always at hand. "You're safe. The stable's gone, but you're safe." He drank, slowly, his hand shaking too badly to hold the cup himself, so that she had to guide it to his lips. When he had drunk his fill, he lay back against the pillow, his eyes never leaving her face, and something in his expression, a kind of dawning, wondering gratitude, made her look away, oddly embarrassed, and busy herself with straightening the blanket. "You pulled me out," he said. It was not quite a question. "I did what anyone would have done." No, his voice, though weak, carried a certainty that startled her. "No, I don't believe that's true at all." She did not know what to say to that, and so she said nothing, and after a moment his eyes drifted closed again, though his breathing had eased, and Dr. Aldous, when he came to check on his patient an hour later, pronounced the fever finally broken. He gave his name, when he was strong enough to give it, as Mr. Edmund Hale, a name that meant nothing to anyone in the village, and that he offered with a fractional hesitation Marianne noticed, but did not remark upon. He said he had been travelling north on business, when a sudden storm had forced him to seek shelter in the abandoned stable, and that he recalled little of the fire itself beyond smoke and falling timber and then, astonishingly, a woman's face above him in the wreckage. He did not say what business had taken him travelling alone, without servant or horse, dressed plainly though not poorly, so far from any city or great house. Marianne, raised by a father who had been the parish physician before her, and had taught her that a wound often told more truth than the man who bore it, found herself quietly cataloguing the inconsistencies, even as she told herself it was no business of hers. The ring he would not remove. The way he startled, faintly, when Mrs. Wicket addressed him as Sir, with a curtsy she gave to no one else in the village. The manner in which he spoke, when his guard slipped, precise, unhurried, accustomed without thinking to being heard. But he was recovering, and grateful, and increasingly, though she scarcely let herself acknowledge it even in her own private thoughts. He was becoming dear to her in a way that had nothing to do with mystery, and everything to do with the man himself. He was witty in a dry, understated way that took her by surprise the first time it made her laugh aloud in the sick-room, so that Mrs. Wicket looked in to see what the commotion was. He asked after her, not with the idle courtesy of a convalescent making conversation to pass the hours, but with real attention, remembering details she had mentioned only once, asking after her father's practice and how she had come to know so much of medicine herself. "My father taught me," she told him one afternoon, a week into his recovery, as she sat mending a shirt Mrs. Wicket had lent him while his own was beyond repair. He had no son to pass his knowledge to, and I had no aptitude for anything else useful, so he taught me instead. He used to say a physician's daughter ought to be good for something more than embroidery. "And is he proud of you now?" Something in her stilled. "He died 3 winters ago. A fever, the same as took half the parish that year. I nursed 20 families through it, and could not save my own father." He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again his voice had lost its usual light irony. "That is not a failure, Miss Ashworth. I have seen enough of illness and of war to know that some fevers cannot be turned by any skill, however great. You did not fail him. You simply could not perform a miracle, and no one should be asked to." She looked up at him, surprised by the gravity in his tone, by how precisely he had named the thing she had never quite been able to say to herself. "You speak as though you have some experience of it. Of war, I mean." Something shuttered, briefly, behind his eyes, a door closing that she had glimpsed open only by accident. "I have seen enough of the world to know grief when I meet it," he said, which was not quite an answer, and she, sensing the boundary though not understanding it, did not press. It was in such small exchanges, over the following weeks, that something began to grow between them that neither named aloud. He was strong enough, by the 2nd week, to sit outside in the garden behind the Wicket cottage, and she took to walking there in the evenings after her father's, now her own small inheritance of patience, had been seen to, ostensibly to check his dressings, but in truth simply to sit with him, as the light faded, and talk of nothing in particular, which somehow became, between the two of them, conversation of the most particular kind. He asked her opinion on matters she had never been asked her opinion on before. Questions of justice, of how her estate ought to treat its tenants in a hard winter, of whether mercy or firmness better served a community in crisis. She answered honestly, sometimes bluntly, expecting perhaps to be corrected or indulged as a woman's opinions so often were by men of any standing. He never did either. He listened as though her answers mattered, weighed them, sometimes argued, sometimes conceded, and once told her, with an odd, careful gravity, that she had changed his mind on a matter he had considered settled for years. "What matter?" she asked, curious. "Whether kindness is a weakness in one who must govern others," he said. "I had thought, once, that a man in a position of authority could not afford too soft a heart, that mercy shown too freely bred disorder. You have persuaded me otherwise. I have watched you these weeks. How you tend to the widow Cray's chest complaint without payment. How you sat up 2 nights with the Pruitt boy's fever, though you had your own work waiting. Your kindness has not made you weak. It has made you formidable." She did not know how to answer such a thing, spoken so plainly and with such evident sincerity, and so she looked instead at her hands, folded in her lap, and felt her face warm in a manner that had nothing to do with the evening's mildness. It was around the 4th week of his convalescence, when he had grown strong enough to walk unaided about the village and had begun, at Mrs. Wicket's gentle urging, to speak of continuing his journey north, that the first true shadow fell across the easy warmth that had grown between them. A rider came through the village, a gentleman's servant in fine livery, asking at the inn whether any stranger injured in a recent fire had been sheltered nearby. Word of it reached Marianne within the hour, carried by half the parish's gossip, and she felt a cold unease settle in her stomach, even before she reached the Wicket cottage to find Edmund. She had come by now to think of him only as Edmund, standing in the small parlour, his face drawn and pale in a way that had nothing to do with his healing burns. "You know that man," she said. It was not a question. He turned to her, and for a long moment said nothing, and in his silence she felt the ground beneath the last month of her life begin, quietly, to shift. "His name is Greaves," he said finally. "He is in my—" He stopped, and something in his throat worked as though the next word cost him a great effort. "In my employ." "Your employ." She repeated the words carefully, as though testing their weight. "Mr. Hale, a man who employs liveried servants to search the countryside for him, does not travel afoot to a market town on ordinary business." He did not deny it. That, more than anything, told her the truth before he spoke it. "My name," he said quietly, "is not Edmund Hale. It is Edmund Grantham. I am the Duke of Ashcombe." The words fell into the small room like stones into still water, and Marianne felt the ripples of them move through everything she had believed of the past month. Every conversation, every quiet evening in the garden, every moment in which she had let herself believe that what grew between them was simple and equal, and hers to claim without fear. A duke. She had pulled a duke from a burning stable with her own 2 hands, had sat beside his sickbed and mended his borrowed shirt, and spoken to him of her father's death, and her own small opinions on justice and mercy, believing all the while that she spoke to a man not so very different from herself. "Why," she said, "when she could trust her voice, did you not tell me?" "At first because I could not. The fever, and then because—" He stopped, and passed a hand over his face, and when he continued his voice had lost all its usual composure. "Because I did not wish it to matter. Because for the first time in longer than I can say, I was spoken to as a man, and not as a title, and I found I did not wish that to end. I was travelling under a false name deliberately, Marianne. I left my estate a month past under circumstances I will explain if you will let me. And the storm that drove me to that stable was no accident of weather alone, but a flight from men I had reason to distrust. I did not plan to deceive you. I only failed when the moment came to tell you the truth, because I was a coward, and because I was afraid of exactly this." "Of what?" "Of watching your face change," he said, very low, "the way it is changing now." She wanted, in that moment, to tell him he was wrong, that nothing had changed, that the man who had thanked her with such quiet gratitude, who had spoken so gently of her father, who had watched her these past weeks with an attention that had begun, God help her, to feel like something she might build a life around, was the same man whether he wore a title or not. But it was not entirely true, and she was too honest, even in her own confusion, to pretend otherwise. Something had changed. The easy equality of the past month, in which she had believed herself simply Marianne Ashworth, physician's daughter, sitting beside a convalescent stranger as his equal in curiosity and conversation, was gone, and in its place stood the vast, immovable fact of rank, a duke, and a village woman who had nothing to offer him but the labour of her hands and a modest cottage inherited from her father. "You should go," she said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that surprised even her. "Your man is waiting. Your household will be anxious. You are recovered enough to travel, I think, if you are careful of the arm." "Marianne, Your Grace," she said, and watched him flinch at the title as though she had struck him. "I am glad you are recovered. I am glad I was able to help you. I wish you a safe journey home." She left before he could answer, walking quickly back through the darkening lane toward her own small cottage, and did not allow herself to weep until she was safely behind her own closed door, where no one, not even the Duke, who had somehow, in the space of a single burning afternoon and the weeks that followed, become dearer to her than she had any right to allow, could see. He did not leave the following morning as she had expected, nor the morning after that. Word reached her, through the ordinary channels of village gossip, that the man called Hale had sent his servant back to the great house with letters, but had himself remained at the wicket cottage, and Marianne, hearing this, felt a confusion of feeling she could not untangle. hope she did not wish to examine too closely, and a wariness that felt increasingly like self-protection against a hurt she sensed was coming regardless of what she did. She avoided the wicket cottage for 4 days, tending her patients with a diligence that left her too exhausted each evening to think over much, though think she did, in the quiet hours before sleep, of grey eyes and a voice gone rough with sincerity, of a man who had called her formidable and meant it. On the 5th day, Mrs. Wicket herself came to Marianne's door, her expression troubled. "You must come," she said. "He will not eat properly, nor rest as the doctor bids him, and he does nothing all day but sit in that garden staring at the gate as though he expects someone. I do not know what passed between you, Miss Ashworth, and it is not my place to ask, but the man is grieving something, and I think you know what it is." Marianne went, though every instinct of self-preservation urged her otherwise, and found him exactly as described, seated in the small garden, thinner than he had been even in his illness, his eyes shadowed with a sleeplessness that had nothing to do with his healing burns. He rose the moment he saw her, too quickly, wincing at the pull on his still-mending arm, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I have not gone," he said finally, "because I could not bring myself to leave without telling you the whole truth, and you would not let me tell it before." "Then tell me now," she said, though her voice was not entirely steady. He told her. He told her of a father who had died when he was young, leaving him a dukedom he had never asked for, and a weight of responsibility that had shaped every year of his adult life into duty and calculation, and the careful management of an estate, and the people who depended upon it. He told her of a betrothal, arranged in his youth, and dissolved only 2 years past under circumstances that had left him distrustful of any woman's interest in him as anything but the title he carried. He told her that in recent months a cousin with claims upon the succession had grown increasingly desperate and increasingly dangerous, and that the flight which had brought him, disguised and alone, into the path of that fatal storm had been an attempt to travel unrecognized to a magistrate in the north who might help him address the matter without the scandal and danger of open confrontation on his own lands. "I did not lie to you about who I am, in the ways that matter," he said. "Everything I told you of my thoughts, my regard, my Marianne. Everything I felt sitting beside you in this garden was true. The only falsehood was my name, and I have come to believe, these past days, that it was the smallest and least important thing about me that I ever hid from you. You let me believe you were an ordinary man. I let you see me as one," he corrected, gently. "For the first time in my life, I was permitted to be simply a man, unweighted by title, and to be valued, or so I dared hope, for nothing but my own character. Do you understand what a gift that was to me? I have been the Duke of Ashcombe since I was 21 years old. Every woman who has ever smiled at me since has smiled, in some measure, at the title. Every friendship I have made has been shadowed by what I might grant or withhold. You alone, in a month of conversations, asked nothing of me and wanted nothing from me but honest company. I did not deceive you to gain something, Marianne. I stayed silent, because I could not bear to lose the one thing that deception, however unintended, had given me." She stood very still, absorbing this, feeling the careful walls she had built over the past 4 days beginning, despite her best efforts, to crack. "And now?" she asked. "Now that I know? What is it you want of me, Your Grace?" "Edmund," he said. "Please, not that. Never that, from you." "Edmund, then, what do you want?" He crossed the small distance between them, slowly, as though giving her every opportunity to step back, and when she did not, he took her hands in his, carefully, mindful still of his healing burns, but with a firmness that spoke of decision rather than hesitation. "I want," he said, "what I have wanted since I woke in that sick-bed and found you had pulled me from a burning building with your own hands, at the risk of your own life, For a stranger you owed nothing. I want to know you fully, as you now know me, and to be known by you not as a duke to be managed or courted for advantage, but as the man I was permitted, for one brief month, to become in your company. I want to court you properly, Marianne, if you will allow it, not in secret, not under a false name, but openly. Whatever difficulty of rank must be overcome to make it possible. I do not offer this lightly. I understand what I ask of you. A life in a world that will judge you, whisper of you, perhaps never fully accept you as you deserve. I offer it regardless, because I have concluded, in 4 days without you, that a dukedom without your company is a poorer thing than I am willing to accept. For a long moment Marianne said nothing, her eyes searching his face for any trace of the calculation, the easy assurance of a powerful man accustomed to receiving whatever he asked for, that she half expected and dreaded to find. She found none. She found only the same man who had thanked her so simply for her kindness, who had listened to her opinions as though they mattered, who had called her formidable and grieved, apparently, in genuine and unguarded sorrow, at the thought of losing her company. You should know, she said slowly, that I am not without pride of my own. I will not be your secret, nor your convenient country amusement, to be set aside when the difficulty of rank grows inconvenient. If you court me as I am, a physician's daughter with soot still under her fingernails and no fortune to speak of. And if your world cannot accept that, then your world and I shall simply have to remain strangers. Then we are agreed, he said, and something in his face, relief and hope, and a tenderness that made her breath catch, broke into what might, in a less careful man, have been called a smile. For I would not have you any other way. He was as good as his word, though the months that followed were not without their difficulty. He returned to his estate within the week, but not before making clear to every person in the village, and, through careful and deliberate correspondence, to every person of consequence in the wider county, that Miss Marianne Ashworth had saved his life at the risk of her own, and that he considered himself in her debt, in a manner no ordinary courtesy could repay. He did not hide his growing regard for her. He wrote to her plainly and often, and when, some 6 weeks after his departure, he returned to the village, not disguised now, but in the full and unmistakable state proper to his rank, with carriage and outriders that set the entire parish buzzing with astonished speculation, he came directly to her cottage and asked, in front of Mrs. Wicket and half the curious village, whether Miss Ashworth would do him the honour of walking with him in the lane. She did, and the village watched and talked, and some of the talk was unkind, for there were those who whispered that a duke's regard for a village woman could only be a passing fancy, that she reached too far above her station, and would be discarded once his curiosity was satisfied, that no good could come of a match so unequal. Such talk reached Marianne's ears more than once in the weeks that followed, and there were nights she lay awake wondering if the whisperers were not, perhaps, wiser in the ways of the world than her own hopeful heart. The distance of rank had not vanished simply because he wished it away. There were dinners at which she felt every eye assessing her manners, her dress, her unfamiliarity with customs she had never been taught. There was a visit from the Duke's aunt, a formidable woman who arrived unannounced to judge for herself, the woman who had so unaccountably captured her nephew's attention, and who spent a full hour interrogating Marianne on matters of household management and precedence, with an expression that gave away nothing of her verdict. But Edmund did not waver, not once, through any of it. He stood beside her at every dinner, corrected every slight before it could fully land, and made plain in word and action both, that his regard was not a passing fancy to be outgrown, but a settled and deliberate choice. When his aunt finally delivered her verdict, grudgingly, but with unmistakable sincerity, that the girl had more sense and steadier nerve than half the ladies of the ton, and that any man fortunate enough to win such a wife ought to count himself blessed rather than diminished, Edmund only laughed, and told Marianne afterward that his aunt's good opinion, hard won, was worth 10 times any easy compliment. The second and greater trial came in early autumn, some 4 months after the fire, when the cousin whose ambitions had driven Edmund into disguised flight in the first place made one final, desperate attempt to press his claim, not through the courts where he had already failed, but through an act of violence meant to remove Edmund from the succession entirely. Marianne learnt of it only after the fact, a shot fired from the trees along the drive of Ashcombe House, as Edmund rode out one grey morning, missing him by a margin so narrow that his coat sleeve was torn by the ball's passage. He was unhurt, though shaken, and the would-be assassin was apprehended within the day by Edmund's own steward and a pair of grooms who had heard the shot and given swift chase. Marianne, arriving at the great house within the hour of hearing the news, found Edmund standing in the entrance hall, giving calm, measured instructions to his household as though nothing at all extraordinary had occurred. And it was only when he turned and saw her, her face white with fear, that his composure finally broke. "You might have died," she said, her voice shaking, "and I would have heard of it by letter, 3 counties away. Too late even to. I did not die," he said gently, crossing to her and taking her hands, careful even now of the tremor in them. "I am here, Marianne. I am entirely here. Do not do that again," she said, half a sob and half a laugh at her own foolishness in scolding a duke for the actions of a would-be murderer. "Do not frighten me so. I did not arrange to be shot at, I assure you," he said, and the dry humour in his voice, so entirely himself even in the aftermath of danger, undid the last of her composure, so that she found herself weeping openly against his uninjured shoulder, while he held her and murmured something low and steadying against her hair. It was in the quiet that followed, after the physician had confirmed he was truly unhurt, after the cousin had been taken into custody and the immediate danger declared past, after the household had settled back into its ordinary rhythms with the particular hush that follows a narrowly averted disaster, that Edmund drew Marianne aside into the small library that had, over the past months, become something like their private sanctuary within the great formal house, and told her that the day's events had clarified for him, with brutal simplicity, exactly what mattered most in his life. "I have spent 4 months courting you with what I believed was patience and propriety," he said, "mindful of your pride, mindful of the difficulties rank imposes, careful never to press you faster than you wished to go. Today a man very nearly ended my life before I had told you, in the plainest possible words, what I have known for months, and been too cautious to say outright. I love you, Marianne Ashworth, not the gratitude of a man you saved, not the fondness of a convalescent for his nurse, but a settled, entire love that has only grown stronger for every month I have watched you move through a world that was never built to welcome you, with more grace and courage than anyone born to it. I do not wish to spend one more day being cautious. Will you marry me?" She did not answer at once, not from doubt, but because the fullness of feeling in her chest made speech, for a moment, entirely impossible. She thought of the burning stable, of the moment she had chosen, without knowing why or who, to run toward danger rather than away from it. She thought of the weeks of easy conversation in the wicket garden, when she had believed herself speaking to an ordinary man, and had given her honest heart, without reservation. She thought of the whispers she had endured, the aunt she had won over, the fear of this very morning, and understood that every step of the long road from that first afternoon of smoke and flame had led, with a kind of quiet inevitability, to exactly this moment. "Yes," she said finally, when she trusted her voice. "Yes, Edmund, I will." He kissed her then, gently, and with a tenderness that held within it all the gratitude and wonder of a man who had been pulled, quite literally, from death by the very woman who now stood ready to build a life beside him, not as a duke and his convenient country bride, but as 2 people who had found, in the strangest and most perilous of circumstances, something rarer than rank or fortune could ever purchase. A love that had been tested by fire, by deception, unmasked, by danger and doubt, and the slow grinding pressure of a world reluctant to bend, and had proven, through every trial, entirely and unshakably real. They were married the following spring, in the small chapel of the parish where they had first met, not the grand cathedral in the county town that convention might have demanded, but the modest stone building where Marianne's own father had been laid to rest, because she had asked for it, and Edmund had granted it without a moment's hesitation, understanding, better than most men of his rank ever learned to, that some things mattered more than appearance. The whole village came, of course, Mrs. Wicket, weeping openly through the entire ceremony, Dr. Aldous beaming with an almost paternal pride, and even the whisperers who had once doubted the match now craning for a better view, their doubts long since converted, by 4 seasons of watching, into something closer to civic pride that their own quiet parish had produced a duchess of such evident quality. Marianne wore, beneath her wedding gown, a small scrap of scorched fabric sewn carefully into the hem, a fragment of the apron she had worn on the day of the fire, kept and treasured through all the months between, a private reminder, known only to herself and to Edmund, of the moment 2 strangers' lives had first collided in flame and smoke, and had never, from that day forward, truly separated again. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had met, for children always ask and always at the most inconvenient moments, tugging at sleeves during quiet evenings by the fire, Edmund would tell it as a grand adventure, full of danger and disguise and narrow escape, while Marianne, listening, would only smile and add, when he finished, the one detail he always somehow left out. "Your father," she would say, "was entirely unremarkable when I found him. Filthy, unconscious, and half buried beneath a burning roof. I had no notion at all that I was rescuing a duke. I only knew that someone needed help, and that I was the only one near enough to give it. And if you had known," Edmund would ask every time, as though the answer might one day change, "would you have gone in after him regardless?" "Of course," she would say, "I would have gone in for anyone. It was only afterward that I learned how fortunate I was in who, precisely, that anyone turned out to be." And Edmund, watching her across the firelit room with the same quiet wonder that had never once, in all their years together, faded into ordinary familiarity, would think, as he thought every single time she told the story, that of all the fortunes rank and title had ever bestowed upon him, none had ever equaled the fortune of a stranger's courage on an ordinary afternoon, when the roof of an old forgotten stable had collapsed in flames, and a woman who owed him nothing had chosen, without knowing his name or his rank or anything at all, beyond the simple fact that a voice cried out in danger, to run toward him instead of away,